Handheld PCs are exploding in popularity, and that's not going to be slowing down anytime soon. And that's awesome because these devices are pretty amazing. But there's only so much you can do with integrated graphics. That's when an external GPU comes in. So today we're going to be taking a look at the OneXPlayer's OneXGPU, which promises to be an all-in-one GPU solution. The OneX GPU is powered by the Ryzen 7600 MXT. It has 8GB of GDDR6 RAM and up to 120 watts power consumption, a 330 watt GAN charger, one USB-C 4.0, two USB-A 3.2 ports, two HDMI, two display ports, one M.2 PCIe port, which I would not recommend using for anything other than storage, more on that here in a little bit, and 1GB Ethernet port. It has an all-metal body that weighs 869 grams, that's without the power supply. The all-metal shell is interesting because it essentially turns the entire outer shell into a giant heatsink. That's a good thing possibly for sustained performance, but it's also not that great because the surface temperatures do get pretty hot, with the back half of the device sitting at about 50 degrees Celsius and the actual vent hitting all the way up to 60 degrees Celsius. Now these temperatures aren't anything really that bad for a GPU as far as the internal temperature, but it will be noticeably hot to the touch. So that's pretty much it for the specs. Let's move on and talk a little bit more about the hardware and see what comes in the box. So the actual look of it is pretty sleek. It has a very minimalistic look, and I do like how sturdy it feels because of that metal shell. But let's take a look at the rest of the physical components, starting with the front. Here we have our power button, and right next to that we have our boost button. This essentially lets it go all the way up to 120 watts from the regular 100 watts that it's pulling. Right next to that is the RGB control button, but unfortunately for this video, my RGB lights stopped working and I couldn't get them to function again. But for me personally, that's not too bad because I'm not a huge fan of RGB lights anyway, so I would rather them not be on all the time. But RGB has its fans, so it's here if you want it. Other than that, we have two full-size USB 3.2 ports in the front, and moving on to the side, we have the rest of our I/O, starting with our Ethernet port, two display ports, two HDMI ports, one Oculink connection, USB-C, and our power connector. Okay, so moving on to the bottom, we have a magnetic cover that helps protect an M.2 slot. And like I was saying earlier about this one, you're really only going to want to use this for storage because if you're trying to run anything off of this drive, you're going to hit a bottleneck because everything has to run through a single port. So if you're trying to play a demanding game, you're not only going to have all the data from the GPU running through there, but the actual game itself. So it's just better to keep this for storage and run whatever game you're going to be playing or even program from your laptop or your handheld. So in theory, this is a great idea, having extra storage so that you can just dock your handheld and your more demanding games are just going to be in that drive and you can play them from there. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that great in actual application. Besides that, we have a couple ribbon cables down here. Two of them are for your RGB lights and the other one is for the buttons in the front. Now, if you didn't want to turn off the RGB lights, you can just unplug them from here because unfortunately, you can't actually do that with the button in the front. So that's pretty much it for the hardware on the main unit. It's a pretty minimalist design altogether, and I appreciate that because it fits my aesthetic a little bit more. Moving on to the rest of the things in the box, we have a USB 4 cable, and it would have been great if they added an Oculink cable, but I guess USB 4 is much more widely available, so it shouldn't be a problem for most people. The last thing to take a look at is the power supply, and this thing is pretty huge. I'm really not sure why it had to be this big, or why they tried to make the actual GPU so small when there's really no need for it. Luckily you can take off the plug itself and plug in your own cable so that this giant thing doesn't have to sit on your wall and stress your outlets. But it didn't make a whole lot of sense to me because the eGPU is something that you don't really need to have it be that portable since it's going to be on your desk most of the time. Making it smaller doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense, at least to me. I really feel like if this would have been a little bit bigger, they could have done a much better job with the cooling, keeping it quieter, and just having everything in one would have probably been a much better package altogether instead of having this giant power block that if you do want to take this with you, you still have to carry that around. So it's not like they're making it much more portable by doing that. In my opinion, this is just kind of a clear case of looks over function because this could have definitely been quieter and cooler to touch. But anyway, I think it's time to wrap this section up and let's go take a look at some benchmarks. For this section, we're going to be taking a look at 3D Mark's TimeSpy and Firestrike scores, as well as the Blender benchmark. Now for this, I was using the EM780 with a 7840U, and I was using the MSI Claw, which has a 155H in it. For the 155, I went ahead and used the max performance mode, boost mode, which is something they introduced not too long ago, and then finally I added the eGPU. For the 7840U, I just used max CDP and then the eGPU. First up with TimeSpy, pretty much across the board, the 155H outperformed the 7840U and actually did it by much more than I thought it was going to be doing it. Strangely, this doesn't really translate over to gameplay as you'll see later, but when I added the eGPU, there was almost a 2.5 times increase in performance out of the 155H and a little bit over a 3 times increase with the 7840U. With Firestrike, we pretty much have more of the same, except when I added the eGPU to the 7840U, it actually outperformed the 155H. But other than that, the 155H, at least in these benchmarks, is outperforming the 7840U by a pretty good amount. However, like I said, when it actually comes down to playing games, that's really not the case. So that's why we can't just take synthetic benchmarks as the end-all be-all. Finally, I also ran the Blender benchmark, which admittedly isn't one that I'm too familiar with, but I wanted to include it because there might be somebody watching this video that could use this information. Now, I will try to get a little bit more comfortable with it so I can give you some better information about what these numbers mean. From what I can tell here, there is a pretty big performance boost. However, again, I am limited as to how applicable this is going to be if you're trying to use this for Blender work. Well, one thing I do want to make note of is that when you're just looking at the Claw versus the EM780, the Claw outperforms it, but when we add the eGPU, it changes. I'm not sure what the problem is here. I know it's not drivers because both are using the latest AMD drivers, so it might just be the port, or maybe the 155H isn't playing as nice with the 7600 MXT. But regardless of what's causing it, I don't think the actual difference in those numbers is going to be anything you would notice in real-world performance. But speaking of real-world performance, I think it's time we move on to some photo and video editing. For video editing, I got some pretty interesting and disappointing results. The interesting part was that the 155H is substantially better at rendering videos than the 7840U, and that when I actually added the eGPU, the rendering times for the video got way worse. I think this is an encoding issue because the actual editing portion of it was much smoother. I was able to do color grading, add effects, and move things around without any real hitches when I had the eGPU connected. But when it came down to rendering the video, the render times were more than double in some cases. For example, this video is about 18 minutes long, it's 4K footage with some color grading. The 155H was able to render in 7 minutes, but when I connected the eGPU, it went up to 17 minutes. That's still not terrible considering I used to have to render videos in about 30 to 40 minutes back when I was using Premiere, but that's still a noticeable difference. Photo editing tends to be much more CPU heavy, so I wasn't even really going to bother with this one, but I figured I'm already going down this rabbit hole, so why not? Both CPUs are more than capable of handling photo editing, so I don't really think you would need an external GPU for this, but if you did need something with a little bit more juice, this will definitely do it. However, again, I don't think it's going to be really necessary for this type of work. The last thing I want to cover before we get into game testing is going to be the fan noise, because this thing gets pretty loud and this could be a deal breaker for some people. So for a comparison, I'm going to be using the Steam Deck OLED, and this is going to be recorded from a mic connected directly to the camera, so there will be some ambient noise as well. So that was the Steam Deck at full load, and that's about as loud as it ever gets. So up next, I'm going to be getting the mic up close to the GPU and recording what it sounds like when it's idling. And now what it sounds like when it's being pushed. It's really difficult to communicate on video just how loud something is, but I would say when it's idling, it's not really something that bothered me. But when it's really pushed, it can definitely get loud, about as loud as a PS4 Pro if you ever used one of those. For me, I was using this hooked up to my TV, so it didn't really bother me because I was far enough away from it. But if I had this on a desk and it was just a few inches away from me, it would definitely bother me. So if you do want to use this on your desk, you're definitely going to want to play with headphones. So that's going to wrap up everything that's not gaming related, from hardware and all the productivity stuff. So let's take a look at FurMark and let's get some games running. Okay, so from this point on, I'm pretty much going to be using the claw for everything, and at the end I'm going to come back to the EM780 just to show a little bit of a comparison. But my main goal here is just to show what type of difference you can get with integrated graphics versus the eGPU. Now, in hindsight, I probably should have used the EM780 just because the claw was a real pain to work with. There was a lot of weird things going on with the software, and even with MSI Afterburner, sometimes things would just stop being reported, so I had to do a bunch of things. But you should be able to see, just based off of the FPS, what kind of performance gains you can expect to have. Now for the claw, everything was tested using the boost mode, which is their maximum performance possible. And here in FurMark, you can see that it went from an average of about 36 to 38 FPS all the way up to 130 to 137. Now you're not going to see a boost of 100 FPS in games just by adding the GPU, but there will be a considerable boost. And now here at the end, you can see when I turn on the boost mode on the eGPU, it actually goes up to about 150. So you do get an extra about 15 FPS just by turning on that boost mode, which adds at about another 20 watts to the total power draw. Now, this isn't necessarily going to translate to every single game, but in a few of them, once you do enable that, you are going to notice improved performance. Okay, now to actually run some games, and let me just explain how I'm going to be doing this. Again, this is all going to be done with the claw, and at the end, I'm going to take a look at the EM780 with that 7840U. Okay, so all of these games are going to be running at 1080p low, and the reason for that is just I'm trying to keep things as even as possible to show what kind of a jump in performance we can see. With the first 4 games, it's just going to be a direct comparison, and then after that, I'll add 2 games with FSR and FrameGen, and then finally, I'm going to be running the Cyberpunk benchmark with ray tracing. It's going to be set to ray tracing low, but still just want to see what kind of performance we can expect if you do want to push it a little bit more. So let's get into it. First up, we have Residen Evil 4.
Anyone home?
Feels good. Seeing the guys who escaped last year going back to the raft.
Real good. The raft's an eyesore, but it's secure. As long as the octopus-related flaws have been fixed.
Let's hope. Okay, closing in on you. Be there soon. Should let Mom know I'll be late.
Miles, ¿qué tal? Did you get the shopping list?
Hey, Mom. Yeah, but the bodega was out of coconut milk. Gonna check a store downtown.
Why are they doing that?
Keep looking at me, baby. Over there! We're gonna get out of this. I promise. Get back! There's too many of them! This will...
Tell me when to shoot.
Going dog! Cut them down!
So the last game I took a look at was Cyberpunk, and with this one, just like with a few of the other ones, the frame rate basically doubled. both on just 1080p low and then with low ray tracing. Now, low ray tracing is probably something I wouldn't even really recommend doing unless you really want to push it a little bit more. It's not really something you're going to notice too much, and you're just basically taxing the system a little bit more than necessary, but it's really up to you. Now, most games, they double their frame rate, but in some games like Miles Morales and The Last of Us, the bump wasn't as big as I had hoped. They did feel a little bit smoother, but it really didn't feel like it made that big of a difference. What did make a huge difference was adding FSR and then frame gen, which is something you could do with just the integrated graphics, but to get the most out of frame gen, you want your base FPS to already be as high as possible. So since this eGPU is giving you a performance boost, it's just going to feel that much better when you do it. It was basically the same story with the EM780, except the games did run a little bit better, even though the Claw outperformed it in the benchmarks when it came down to the games themselves. Everything was running smoother, and I noticed slightly higher FPS on all of them. Now, I'm not really going to run through all of the games, I'll just show them quickly, because I don't want to make this video longer than it needs to be, and I'm pretty sure at this point you kind of get the idea of what type of benefit this could give you. So now it comes down to, is it worth it or who is this for? And I would say if you're somebody that's very invested in the whole handheld PC ecosystem, or you have a laptop and you just want to be able to boost that performance, then this is something to consider. However, for $699, you could build your own eGPU. The thing with that is it's not going to be as compact or kind of an all-in-one solution. It will take up more space, but you do have more of an upgrade path down the road if you decide to upgrade that GPU. So it's kind of hard to say that I would fully recommend this to everybody that has those devices because of that price tag. Now, if you were to find this on sale, let's say down to around $550 USD, then I would definitely consider it because there is a sizable boost in performance. However, you do have to consider that. So that is just something you can't ignore, that yes, there are going to be cheaper solutions. And for $699, you can pretty much build a whole PC. Now, if you are somebody that says, you know what, I'm pretty committed to the laptop and handheld PC ecosystem, one thing to keep in mind is that the Z1 Extreme chip and the Ally, Ally X, and Legion Go is going to have some driver issues with this eGPU because they're not using the regular AMD drivers. They're using special drivers for the Z1 Extreme chip. There are community tools that can help you switch back and forth between those so you don't have to reinstall them, but it is something that you will have to deal with, and some games are going to have to reload shaders every single time you switch back and forth. So keep that in mind. It is going to be plug and play for the most part, but you will have those hitches every now and then. All that being said, I have enjoyed using it. It is something that I can see myself using more in the future. I'll have to see if it's something that I'm actually going to be able to keep, because there seems to be a little bit of an issue with One X right now, whether they're going to ask for this back or not. I haven't seen this video, so it's not anything to do with my review of it or anything like that. It was just a misunderstanding. However, if I do keep it, I will report back in a couple months, let you know how it's been going and how well it's paired up with other handhelds, mini PCs, all that stuff. Now, if all of that was not a deal breaker for you, if you're still considerate, then I will have links in the description below. The Amazon one will be an affiliate link. I hope you would consider using that one. I would appreciate it. It helps support the channel. It will not increase the price for you in any way. Well, that's going to wrap it up. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it was helpful. And if you have any experience using the OneXGPU, please let me know. Share it in the comments below. I would love to hear your experience with it. And if you haven't done so yet, please don't forget to subscribe. I appreciate it. Have a great day, and I'll see you on the next one.